No, it was.
Yeah, there we are.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I hope you can hear us and that this is all working right. And we're trying a new thing. We're gonna try doing this last session using Zoom, which I hope you all bought stock in around March 1st, and then sending that from Zoom onto Facebook Live. So we should be live on Facebook, and this will allow us to share the screen and show some of the visual artwork that we'd like to have some conversation about today.
Okay, so it's just 10:01. We might want to say all that.
Right.
I think people are probably, no one has gotten on yet. So we might need to say this again.
Yeah. All right.
Let us know you're here. It helps.
Welcome everybody to Bibles, Bagels, Beals,
Coffee.
Part 3 on Revelation and the Apocalyptic Imagination. Say something about all that.
Oh, yes. So Part 3 on Revelation, Apocalypticism, Sunday mornings. This has been a really good, I think, a good series. I think people have enjoyed it and have had good questions. So the last 3, it's only 10:01, so I'm a little, okay.
We started at 10, right?
We start at 10, but I feel like people are just coming in. I know we have 14.
We won't see the feed like we normally do. You can kind of see it there, yeah.
Hi, good morning. Yay. Your mom is here.
Great.
Yay.
Hey, Mom.
Hey, Mom. Okay, so start over with the Zoom. Tell them what we're doing with Zoom.
Third time to start.
Welcome.
Welcome everybody to Bibles, Bagels, and the Beals. We're continuing our conversation about the book of Revelation and apocalyptic imaginations and the kind of afterlives of Revelation, the ways it takes on new lives in throughout cultural history, throughout religious history. Today we are running the session through Zoom, so you might notice that we're no longer left-handed. Our parts are on the right sides of our head, I think.
Are we?
I don't know. At least through Zoom
kind of looks that way, but I don't know.
Facebook may still have us
backwards.
Inverted.
Someone asked if we stopped wearing our wedding rings on the.
Yeah.
No, we're still on the same.
Yep.
It just looks different.
And anyway, so this is our third of 3 sessions. It's been fun, and we wanted to do this through Zoom so that it's easy to share the screen and to look at some art together, because that's what we're going to do today is look at explore some of the ways that Revelation takes on new life, new forms throughout its history, especially through the work of religious visionary artists. And so we're going to look at one from 1,000 years ago and one from a half century ago, and just sort of explore the ways Revelation sort of gets reimagined and takes on new meaning, new significance in history.
Yeah, what strikes me about those who have the artists who have filled out the book of Revelation in aesthetic ways. You talk about them being aesthetic spirituality, and what else did you say? You had 2 different apocalyptic spirituality, but it as I was reading about this, it occurred to me that someone say you have to be a mystic to read the book of Revelation in some ways. I know there are those who logistically try to figure out dates and times and what is equivalent to other things and use it more like a puzzle or something, engineering puzzle. But I think the ones that are interesting are very artistic and aesthetic and help us, I don't know, just fill it out in a different kind of way. So I like this session talking about these real spiritual visionaries and mystics. And I know there are mystics among this group who are watching that will appreciate this as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think part of what you're saying, Clover, about the kind of aesthetic spirituality, part of what I meant by that was aesthetics have to do with the senses, right? Anesthesia means you don't feel anything. Aesthetics are smell and sight and sound and taste and touch. And in fact, there's a wonderful book by our good friend Brent Plate, which I would really recommend, called Religion in 5.5 Objects. And he explores religion through the 5 senses. And in each chapter, like for taste, he focuses on bread in religion. And for smell, I think it's incense. And for sound, it's drums. And, religion is aesthetic. It's about the body. It's about embodied sense perception. And these aesthetic visionaries are working with their hands and we'll talk about Hildegard of Bingham. She has very powerful embodied sense experiences. She sees differently, she hears differently, she feels in her body differently, like a fire coming over her.
That's a great description.
Very, very much embodied. And so I think that's part of what we're saying. And then the other is that when you just sit and try to read the book of Revelation, and we'll talk about this, but Hildegard never really did that. She absorbed texts from the biblical text of Revelation in different ways because of the way scripture circulated in that context. But when we read it, I think we've all had that experience already, even just in what we've studied in these sessions. You get kind of overwhelmed. It's like, I can't even make a picture of this. I can't figure out what's going on. It's just this barrage of images, sometimes very violent, sometimes just, overwhelming in other ways. And I think that these are aesthetic responses to that overwhelming aesthetic experience of the book of Revelation in art. So that's part of what's fun and interesting about this process.
You said in the book, you said that Hildegard just took bits and fragments, and then she talked over and over about ingesting, that it was all ingested and part of her, and you couldn't you couldn't take it apart. It was all intertwined or intersectional or something like that, intertextual.
The term she uses for understanding or perception of scripture, I forget exactly how to pronounce it correctly in Latin, but it can also be translated taste. Understanding perception as tasting scripture, and that's
and all the senses, right? She talked about all the sensual experience of it. She's great. I loved reading about her.
Good. And so what we're doing, this book that we keep plugging, the Book of Revelation, a biography
written by
this guy,
the Beale,
it is. It's less about the biblical text of Revelation and more about how Revelation keeps on taking on new lives. It's about the many lives of Revelation, not just as a book, but as visual art, as film, as sound, as literature, because that's how we know Revelation, not just as a biblical text. That's part of this big kind of constellation of things, of media that are Revelation, but that's just one part of it. And sometimes the ways it takes on new life are really, interesting and surprising. And so we wanted to just focus on 2 examples of that. Gave you a little bit of the 2 chapters related to these 2 examples on the Facebook feed. So if you're interested, if you haven't had a chance to look at them, that's okay. We'll try to kind of give a little overview, but you can take a look at those for as long as I'm able to keep them up there. It's copyrighted stuff, so I've shared them in this private group, and I'll probably take it down fairly soon. But to kind of get a little bit of the life story of these 2 people, and then we'll share screen and look at some of the visual work that they've done. So one of them is Hildegard of Bingham, who was born in 1098 Common Era, so back in Y1K. We went through Y2K a couple decades ago, but this was 1,000 years before that. Also a very interesting time with a lot of apocalyptic speculation going on, and just a remarkable human being, a very, very formidable world spiritual leader, really, for the church at the time. And then we'll jump ahead almost 1,000 years to James Hampton, who was a remarkable artist who was only discovered for his art when he died. And someone discovered this incredible throne room that he had been creating for 15 years in a garage that he'd been renting out in Washington, D.C. And now that is in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. So these are the two examples we'll look at: aesthetic, apocalyptic spiritualists in different ways.
And I'm just going to jump in as we go
Yeah,
along.
no, that's good.
Big surprise. What strikes me about both those artists, both those interpreters, is they're outsiders. They're people on the margins. So, right, Hildegard being a woman of her time, and then in a Benedictine monastery, convent, whatever, and then James Hampton being an African American man who was of humble means, and so both of those who are both biblical visionaries, but from the margins, looking in and seeing something very different.
And a question maybe for us to keep in mind in relation to that point is, how does being an outsider and an outsider artist in some sense, how does that change your perception, and how does that open you maybe to what we might think of as kind of outsider art in the Bible with the book of Revelation? How does being an outsider, being on the margins versus being in the center, in the mainstream of culture, enable you to see differently and to interpret differently in ways that might be seen as, almost crazy, visionary, or something else by different.
It's only in hindsight where people appreciate mystics.
Right.
It's not in the middle of it. And that reminds me of Robert McAfee Brown's book, Reading the Bible Through Third World Eyes. I was thinking reading Revelation through people on the margins, right? Yeah. How different that is than if you were reading Revelation as the person in power. Absolutely. Or the people who control versus those who feel not in control.
Right. Definitely.
Maybe different.
So that's another thing that we might want to kind of keep in our mind while we're talking about this. So let's dive in on Hildegard of Bingham. What do we want to say about Hildy, as we like to call her?
As we like to call her around here.
Yeah. So she was German. Born in 1098.
She was possibly the one of the youngest, or 10th child of a group of big gaggle of children. And well, what I read, it's not completely clear, more than I do, but that she was perhaps given over to the monastery or community at around 8 years old, or committed to it, or between 8 and 14, it looks like. And she was put under the care of a young girl who was only about 6 years older than her, Jutta. And Jutta became, actually, Hildegard taught her to read. And anyway, so she was her mentor, but their whole lives.
Jutta was older and really a mentor to her. Yeah. And Hildegard did follow her into the convent, and was the sort of senior figure in that community.
Jutta was. The abbess, right?
And then she was very, very extreme ascetic, not aesthetic. It's different. Depriving the body, lots of fasting, and so-called humiliation of the flesh. So she was very severe, Jutta was, and died when Hildegard, I think, was in her early 40s. And that really kind of was the beginning of a new era for Hildegard. She had really been serving Jutta and just exploded with productivity.
It was like the tomb had been opened,
Totally,
and
totally.
oh my gosh, the brilliance of Hildegard. I
Yeah.
really had no idea her complexity of intelligence and capability.
Mhm.
Wow.
She published, at least we know of, 5 big books, biographies of saints and
Yep.
medical manuals, and the one we'll talk about today called the Scivias, the Know Thy Ways, which is a series of visions. She also composed something like 70 musical arrangements.
Yeah, I read that she might be one of the most frequently performed pieces of music,
Yeah.
but discovered late.
Yeah.
From the
her music was not as popular as her visions were early on. Very powerful woman in her world. She wrote and reprimanded popes and kings and told them what for. She had a kind of prophetic identity,
political and
that was
ecclesial.
Yeah, that was believed to be from God, and so she had that kind of authority she could speak from. People came to her from all over, from all over Europe for her help and for her advice. She gave also medical advice and medical cures, sermons and letters, countless sermons and letters. Just incredibly prolific human being, and lived a long time.
Yeah, 81 years.
Yeah, for that period, that's incredibly long.
Her life disrupts our stereotypes of women being not powerful during those times. Occasional woman who manifested power.
And I think too that's related to the monastic life. That was an avenue for women to find authority and power outside of marriage.
Right.
So that we see that as one way that women were able to find voice and power and authority.
Well, they're outside the patriarchy in that way. Yeah, exactly. Okay, go for it.
So that's a little bit about her. We want to focus on the work that is most engaged with Revelation. It's called, we nickname it Scivias. It's short for a longer Latin name that means know the ways of the Lord. And it is a series of visions. It took her, I believe, 10 years to write. I should know that. I wrote about it, but I can't remember exactly. 26 visions in it. And this is text and image. So there are images in this text, and then there's writing. And we don't know exactly how the images and the text came together in the long run. Remember, this is a long time ago, and it's very difficult to reconstruct. But one thing we know is that Hildegard was a picture thinker, that when she received visions, they weren't just words, they were images. And in her text, she describes them and then tries to interpret them, but she probably also drew them. And in fact, we can jump ahead and share the screen about one of the first visions in her Scivias. Did I not include it after all of that? Okay, I'm gonna have to try to pull it up here. Yeah, it won't take me but a second. Sorry.
So that's just a different one?
That's not the one I wanted the one that's at the beginning of her Scivias, where she actually it's a picture of her having her vision. So just give me a split second here and I'll find it. There it is. All right. I'm going to open that, and then I'm going to go back to the Zoom and choose screen share. And there it is. Okay, sorry about that delay, but anyway, so this is from the first page of the Scivias, and this is her, this is a depiction of what she describes as these tongues of flame coming down on her, and she is there with her tutor and secretary, who is watching on, and you can see in this image that she is, there we go, a little bit bigger, that she has this pad that she's writing on, and this is a wax pad. This is how they would sketch things. You had wax and you'd write into the wax, and then you could erase it. It was sort of like an erasable board. But if you look at the way she's holding her stylus there, it looks like she could be actually drawing instead of writing, and describing what she's drawing then to her companion, who might be taking dictation or something like that. But this is a representation very early of her actual visionary experience and how it went. And so many have argued that probably even her original visions included both drawings and written representations. And by the end of her life, they were already working on full manuscript versions of these, because she was becoming so famous throughout Europe that people wanted them and wanted to be able to read these. She became kind of reader digested, like where there'd be like shorter versions of collections of her visions that people would circulate and read. At any rate, so that's what this is, and we just wanted to share a couple particular representations that relate especially to Revelation. And so here is one that is an image of the, are you able to see it? Are people able to see it?
Yeah, they were.
All right,
Yep.
because I didn't see it on
No,
yours.
it
Oh, there
was,
it is.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. So this, you might guess, is the image from Revelation of the binding by Christ when Christ returns of the red dragon, who is the devil and Satan. That's the main representation of the devil and Satan in the book of Revelation. And here you can see it's chained and bound, and that is a sort of small image of, I suppose, the lake of fire that it's about to be put into. All kinds of things that we could talk about in terms of the way text and image are interrelated and intertwined here. The use of color and non-color, as these, I assume these are the martyrs who are with Christ, who were killed on his, for the sake of him and witness of him, who are there witnessing the dragon, who is Satan, being bound.
Now, is that the 144,000 or just
no,
the 12
this is those remember when Christ comes
martyrs
back, there's the image of the martyrs who come up first. Okay. And they still have their wounds, and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years while the devil is bound. And then after the 1,000 years, the devil will be let out for 3.5 years, and then comes the final judgment day. At least that's one way of reading the Revelation text. Whether that's exactly what she's doing here is an interesting question, because her descriptions pick up tons of little bits and pieces from Revelation, but they tie them in with all kinds of other stuff, Augustine and other thinkers, because, and this is important to remember, Hildegard didn't sit and read the Bible. Like, she didn't ever sit and read the book of Revelation as a biblical text. It was part of what was called the Lectio Divina, the divine readings, the readings of sacred texts. And she would have memorized and internalized different scriptural passages, verses and images, but they would be all mixed together with, texts from the church fathers and from other theologians and Augustine and other visionaries and so forth. So the way she absorbed scripture, including Revelation, would have been all blended together into this intertextual, dialogical space of scriptural.
It's not different really than what we do.
No, that's true.
We have bits and pieces, and Henry Nouwen and Richard Rohr and all these other voices that come in with little bits that mean a lot to us. That's interesting. Yeah. We don't memorize scripture in the whole book or
no. In fact, that's where our word lectionary comes from, right? Is the same bits context readings, like pulling bits and pieces.
That practice too.
Yeah. Same word. Yeah. We talked last time, we read the last chapters of Revelation and looked at that image of the new heaven and the new earth. And so thought we could look at a couple of the images of that here as well. So this is That's the day of the great Epiphany or Revelation. This is Christ's second coming. In fact, this is the text that is related to that in her text. She says, "And suddenly from the east a great brilliance shone forth, and there in a cloud I saw the Son of Man, with the same appearance he had had in the world, and with his wounds still open, coming with with the angelic choirs. He sat upon a throne of flame, glowing but not burning, which floated on the great tempest, which was purifying the world." So this is an image related to that. And you can see how, I mean, she, in her art, she often segments or interrelates different scenes by putting them in circles or squares. Sometimes they're almost even like a comic book page where you've got a sequence of things happening. And so I don't know exactly how to read these images myself, but I would say this is the tempest in the storm that he's coming down over in the image below, and then that's him coming in enthroned. You can see he has the wounds as she described, and he's in an appearance, a human appearance there. You've got the saints welcoming him. You've probably got the beginning of judgment going on here too, because you've got, again, the devil in chains, or maybe that's the beast in chains down there in the bottom right-hand corner. I don't know if you all are looking at this inverted or not, but in one corner, and you've got those who are judged and are going to be in the lake of fire with them versus those who are being raised from the dead. So you've got the bones down there of the dead, and then they're coming up into human form again. It's a very busy scene. It's a lot going on.
Yeah, but it depicts the energy and movement and overwhelmingness of the book itself. When you're reading it, there's too much,
right?
And so it's so saturated with image and color and description that in some ways it captures it perfectly.
Yeah.
No, it looks like he has a swimming noodle.
That's his swimming noodle there. Not for the lake of fire, though. Maybe for that other jade-like crystal glass lake.
Maybe.
Or the river that runs through Jerusalem.
Right.
Anyway, so that's another image.
You'll never unsee it now.
Yeah, exactly. Clover's now ruined us with the noodle. Jesus with the noodle. And here is another of the new heaven and the new earth image. And again, you have this really interesting use of these circular shapes and spires and tongues of flame and so forth related to them. She uses a lot of symmetry, a lot of interrelated circle spaces going on, but here then is God enthroned at the top, and going down to earth then here at the bottom, which is renewed. In this section of the Scivias, Hildegard includes all kinds of musical compositions. So she is trying to represent this new heaven and new earth. And part of what she does in the process is build a whole liturgy of music and words with different parts of the heavenly host and the saints participating in different ways. She basically stages the new heaven and new earth in that way. And I think that's a resonance with the book of Revelation, because as we talked about last week, so many of these scenes in the book of Revelation, you sort of imagine you're standing back and here is it all being staged.
No, that's how it feels like John is watching. Yeah. Good word. Good verbiage. Yeah.
Yeah, but John is sort of almost like an audience.
He is, yeah.
And Hildegard definitely depicts and describes these scenes.
Well, and again, she talks about all the senses, or you talk about her, all the senses, and this depicts all the senses, the hearing and the sound and the taste and the the touch. Yeah, that's great.
One thing that we didn't mention, but that would be worth mentioning, is that in her language, in her writing for the Scivias, she very frequently uses the same language that John of Patmos used, which is that, and I looked and I saw. And she is told, write what you see, write and say what you see and hear, whereas John is told, write what you see. But they're both prophets who write, which I think is interesting because, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the Hebrew prophets were not writers. They were performers of their oracles. They were given, according to the narratives, their own narratives, they were given these words to say. So the prophets in the ancient world were performers of their proclamations. They weren't sitting and writing text for people to read, but both John of Patmos and Hildegard are writing what they see, which is a different kind of a genre of prophetic discourse, I think, in some ways.
Well, but Hildegard has, what is his name? Volmar,
yeah.
Volmar, who is her secretary. But John, do they describe anyone who's writing down these visions? Or?
There's nothing indicated, but we don't know in that world whether there might have still been, because clearly Paul had someone writing down what he was saying, because a couple places the secretary will say, oh, and I say hi too to the people who are being addressed, right?
That'd be me.
Pops in, with your noodle. Anyway, so but drawing on that language from John of Patmos, and I looked and I saw, right, what you see lends prophetic authority to her, because then she's basically claiming the same visionary prophetic authority that John had. So that's another way that the book of Revelation finds its way into her writing, is that she's taking on the same voice. She's taking on the same authority as someone whose authority comes from a direct experience, a direct revelation from God. And that gets traction in the world, clearly. So should we shift gears? We're about halfway through. So I'll stop sharing that, and we'll jump ahead almost 1,000 years. We could also talk about another picture thinker from around the same time as Hildegard. They didn't know each other, but Joachim of Fiore, an Italian monastic, incredible, complex picture thinker in which the visual depictions that he uses are much more symbolic, and they play out into contemporary thinking that we know today as dispensationalism, thinking about the different eras in the history of the world and so forth. But there is a chapter on Joachim in the book too that I'd love to get your feedback on. But we're going to jump ahead to James Hampton. So what can we say about James Hampton? He no one knew about him, or only maybe his sister and his late brother before his brother died, and I'm sure family in South Carolina, where he was born and where he lived until he was 19 years old. But he hit
So he was born in 1909.
1909.
Yep.
And moved to Washington, D.C., probably with his brother, when he was 19 years old. He, but before we get to his own story, the way he became known in the world was that he had been renting out a garage space in Washington, D.C. for almost 15 years from this guy, and the landlord, he'd always send his rent in on time. I think something like $50
a month, you said.
And then one month he didn't get the rent. The landlord didn't get the rent, didn't get it again, couldn't get hold of him, of James Hampton. And it turned out that James Hampton had actually died of stomach cancer. And his only survivor in the area, I think, was his sister. The landlord goes and busts open the lock on the door.
Well, I was just to back up and be clear about his life, unless I missed it. So we
want to tell his life story for sure.
Yeah, well, just to lay out again that he African-American man born in humble South Carolina in a
Right.
small town, moved to DC in 28, was drafted into the Army and served there for just a few years, was discharged, and then just served as a night janitor for all
Right.
those years from 45 until 64 when he died. Anyways, just that image of this really humble man with this whole artistic world going on behind him.
Exactly. And no one even thought about any of that or knew about any of that until this discovery. And as soon as this discovery happened, then people tried to start to do the research and found it difficult. So wait, that did not work right. It's not the one I want to share. Try it again. I just wanted to show the image of.
It's here.
Okay, it's there, but not here. That's interesting.
There it is.
All right. So this is, if you can imagine being that landlord and knocking open the padlock on the garage door and looking inside and flipping on the lights and these 500-watt, is it not?
It's here.
That's not
No,
the
you
one
just
I want.
moved it.
Okay, it's just moving. Oh, you're just on delay. That's all. I forgot that that's what
Move
you're
it back
watching.
to the main one here.
Nope, I want to show this one first.
Oh, in the garage door, right.
And then go back to his life story and just unpack that a little bit more.
Well, that gives a perspective of scale too.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? So that throne there, the highest, thickest object there in that view is something like 7 feet off the ground. He had 500-watt light bulbs all over in here. So when the landlord turned them on, this is what he saw. He had no idea that James Hampton had been doing this. He knew nothing about James Hampton. And he ends up calling an artist friend, and the artist friend connects with some people who are big in the art buying world and the Smithsonian. And that's where it all begins. Not long after that, this work of art makes it into the newspapers in Washington, D.C., and eventually becomes a permanent installation, just to jump ahead briefly, at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. But in this early time, nobody knew anything about him. And that's when people started trying to, because the art was incredible. So just to get a feel for what you're looking at, these are creations made from found stuff, from tinfoil, from construction paper, from dead light bulbs, from candy bar wrappers, from alcohol bottle labels, and from old furniture that he'd pick up on the side of the road. This, what you're looking at now, is half of a round dining room table that he'd sawed in half to turn into an altar. And so all from found art. And very, very, by the way, very, very fragile and precarious in terms of the preservation of it. Wow. So once they discover the art, then they start to try to learn more about this person and realize it's very, very hard to learn much of his story. And what you were summarizing there is just what I was able to find from those who had done some research early on about his story and his life, that he was born in South Carolina, very early, at age 19, moved to DC with his brother, that he served in World War II in a segregated unit in Guam in particular. There's indication that already while in Guam, he began to have these visions because, and we think it's this piece right down at the bottom here, he built a little altar, and on the back of it, it indicates that it was created in Guam on a particular date. When he returned honorable discharge to a very modest, humble life, mostly as a janitor. I think he worked as a cook at some times as well. But very, very humble, modest life, very much a solitary person, had a few friends who remember him sharing some of this with them. A woman in particular that he showed it to, and that may be who took the pictures we have of him that I'll show in a second. But so that's his story, and we didn't learn anything about him really until the discovery of this incredible
Amazing.
work of art. There is so this right here is an image of it in the Smithsonian, and you get a better sense for how the color was used. This is a very kind of shrunken down version of the actual throne room that was there in the garage, which was maybe 3-4 times bigger. The different altars and thrones would have been spread out. There were actually 12 of these plaque-like images on each side. On one side, it was the 12 apostles in the New Testament. On the other side, it was the 12 tribes of Israel. The whole thing is created in this total symmetry where everything on one side is New Testament related, and then everything on the other side is Old Testament related, and each object is made to correlate. The New Testament correlate to the Old Testament in that. Just incredibly complex and detailed. You can see
The
how
symmetry
the color
is just so perfect.
Yeah.
Huh.
And they've had to reduce what was there as no doubt a greater symmetry in the actual exhibit. So if we jump ahead briefly, so this is one portrait we have of James Hampton that was taken of him. You can see he's actually wearing one of the crowns, one of the 7 crowns that you see down there on the ground in the Smithsonian image. And then he's holding another of the crowns, wearing a suit. So it's a quite formal portrait of him there in the garage. You can see the brick where he is. And then this one is another portrait of him. And in this one, you get a better feel for how big and ornate and complex was the installation there in the garage itself. Much more spread out, with again everything in symmetry, and you can see part of the 12 plaque-like things on the walls on the side there.
Well, it just gives a perspective of size.
Yes,
with him
right.
standing
It
there.
says 7 feet, and you can see this is a good 2+ feet higher than he is in the back there. Again, wearing a suit, and in his hand here is a book that was also found on this desk over here when they began to discover this work that he had done. And this book is called, the title is something like the St. James 7th Dispensation, but it is a
referring to himself.
Yes, he called himself St. James in the text oftentimes. Clearly saw himself, self-understood as
a receiver
as
of
something
visions.
like John of Patmos, as a visionary receiver of visions, expressing it in this aesthetic way, as you said earlier, and in writing. And so what is in his hand here, in his right hand, is a book that's handwritten. It has a little over 100 pages in it, and it's written in his own encrypted script. No one has been able to crack the script. I went to the Smithsonian archives and got to look at it in person, and I have some plans for trying to figure out if there's a way to decrypt it, but it has not ever been successfully.
You have plans?
Yeah, machine learning.
If anyone can, it'd be you.
It's going to be one of the first projects of our little machine learning group. At any rate, and it very clearly a language of some kind, and references to Revelation in it at different points as well. And then down here in the corner, the third heaven, it says, this was a little piece of paper tacked to the photo in that room. And then it says the second Corinthians 12:2-3. And so that is a reference to 2 Corinthians, Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. And there is where Paul says, I know someone, a lot of people think he was talking about himself, who was taken up to the third heaven and given this mystical experience, this visionary experience, right? So Paul is acknowledging that people have had that kind of mystical experience. It's interesting to ask, is that what this installation is? The third heaven, is that what this is? Or does James believe that he was taken up into the
It
third
sounds
heaven
like
to
it, yeah.
have this vision,
Or both.
or both. And all over all of these objects on the backs and the fronts are scriptural references, writing again in his own script, and interpretations that connect the New Testament with the Old Testament. He clearly saw, for him, I think, again, the book of Revelation provided this kind of key for understanding all of world history, the whole history of creation, culminating in what he believed was the beginning of the seventh millennium, which was underway and would be, the return of Christ enthroned and rule for 1,000 years. And I think he believed he was creating the space to host that second coming, that arrival, or a kind of meditation on that, a kind of anticipation of that. Yeah, very powerful and beautiful. And just to get a close up of the work he did, the meticulous work he did with such fragile and perishable materials that were free.
Foil.
Yeah,
from
probably
candy wrappers or gum wrappers.
Wrappers, and then little nails through the cardboard to hold things in place.
And that's the
Typed,
light bulb.
The light bulb on the top, that's right. And he typed on these little plaques, Revelation 7, verse 3, which is part of a vision that John has of the 144,000 of the Israelites. That's 12 times 12, back to the numerology stuff. So the 12 tribes, 12 from each of the 12 tribes. And he saw these crowns as, there's only 7 of them, so that's interesting. But 7 crowns were going to represent maybe the 7 nations that would gather under the enthroned God. Yet in the text it's 12, so it's interesting to think about that. He's probably putting together in his vision parts from Revelation 4, which is that wild throne room of heaven scene that we read last week with the elders and the creatures with the eyes all around, plus Revelation 7, the gathering of the nations, plus then the end of Revelation, the new heaven and the new earth, and the reign of Christ with all of the nations coming and bowing down. Some combination like that.
So it's, and I know this isn't the complete picture, but it's so complete. Do you feel like he completed it, that he finished it before he died? Or because you don't have the sense that he's still working on it. Do you think he had an idea that he was dying and he expedited the finishing of it before?
Really good
because
question.
If he died of stomach cancer, it was probably going on for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems complete. Did they talk about that?
No, I mean, we have no diary from him. He talked with the landlord one time and said something about it being his life's work in there, but the landlord had never seen it, didn't know what it was.
Huh.
He had a friend who, someone took these pictures of him.
Yeah.
I think it was someone from work. I think early on he might have even, I can't remember. I know he had a boarding. He boarded somewhere, which many people in that time did. It didn't have much money, share a bathroom, and just basically a room with a bed. And I think he decided to start renting this space because he didn't have enough room in his sleeping space anymore for it. But that's a good question. If he knew that he had stomach cancer, he might have worked on finishing it.
This vision. His sister said his sister didn't want it when the landlord called.
Early on, I think. Later it sounds like there must have been some negotiation once people began to realize the value.
Valuable.
Just think if someone else had discovered it and just like stuck it in a dumpster or something like that. I mean, it could have happened.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And isn't it held up as one of the greatest pieces in the folk
considered
art
perhaps the greatest work of folk art, of American folk art of all time?
Yeah.
Certainly it is what we might call outsider art. I think I described him in the Facebook post as an outsider visionary artist. I don't know how to categorize him, but in this other book that both of us were part of, Roadside Religion, we went around the country and visited these places that were often like whole town blocks, where, or even bigger, where these people who had had visions and religious experiences would like try to manifest them in space as these kind of massive installations and welcome people into them. In some ways, that's
very similar.
what this is. Like, it's going to last as long as he's alive. The work of it, it doesn't end until you're done in some way.
Yeah. It reminds me of that monk in monk in that monastic community in Alabama who made full with pieces of leftover things and pieces of junk, and he created landscapes of the biblical, Jerusalem biblical images, and throughout the park it was interactive in more life-size kind of experience.
And it was just very modest, quiet.
His whole life was that. His meditative prayer life was putting these things together.
And he too made most of it from discards, broken test tubes and broken pieces of pottery.
The other brothers would save things for him to create. Well, so we have 9 minutes.
Right.
What about Revelation?
This is, I want to say this is Revelation.
No, I know it is.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that Revelation, the book, the image, the whatever Revelation is, Apocalypticism keeps erupting. They keep erupting into our lives and into our history at interesting times. At the turn of the millennia, that all of a sudden it evokes something in us to imagine a different world, or I don't know, something else breaking into our history.
Yeah, I was thinking about that this morning, thinking about your and Ian's sermon, which I just heard, talking about in some ways asking, are we at a moment where like some new era is happening? Something is actually a really major, not just a paradigm shift, but a change from one era to another. Are we, or are we going to go back?
Right. Try to go back.
With the cracks in the foundation of the house are becoming very clear. And is that going to be washed away in something new, or is what's going to happen? And then you were listening to, when you're getting ready, to Bob Dylan, the times they're changing. The old world is rapidly fading. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand. The times they are changing.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was like 19, listening to that song. I still love Bob Dylan, but loved it then, and thinking and being on board with that, and this notion that a new era is dawning, which I think it probably felt that way in that time too. I wasn't 19 in the 60s, but I was listening to it later. But that, and then I think this is the imagination that Hildegard had. We are at the end of the millennium, and a new millennium is coming, and we need to get ready for it. I think James Hampton too. These are the signs that something is happening, something is coming. And then I think, do I ever think that way? Have I become? Is it me? I don't know. I find it very hard to think in terms of like the dawning of a new era, of kind of radical revolutionary change happening. I don't know if I did when I was younger and I have become too much part of the status quo and the institutions that benefit now, that I find that harder to do, or if I've become cynical.
Well, we're just maybe under all of that is fear that it actually is happening, and that we have to give something up. We are more in the center, the privileged, and not on the outside, seeing things on the in.
Well said.
So we have a totally different perspective on it. And so I think Revelation and Apocalypticism and visionaries like these two, they're disturbing to us. And so I think we look on at them instead of letting ourselves be moved or changed or disrupted by them.
Put them in a
museum.
Put
a museum, and we watch them and we talk about them, and we say, well, that's interesting, what was going on, but but what does it mean for them or the book of Revelation itself
Mhm.
to break us up,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
To interrupt us.
Well said.
Wow. Yeah.
So here we
So
are,
here we are.
the end of this series on
Yeah.
Revelation, and I hope part of what we've seen today with regard to Revelation is really something I wanna push for. I didn't like that we had to call this book the Book of Revelation, a biography. I wanted it to be called Revelation, a biography, because I think
Mhm.
that Revelation is more than the text. And I think a lot of times something like this, what? Oh, yeah, let's go back to us. Something like Hampton's throne room or Hildegard's Scivias, or even that final scene in Hildegard's Scivias, that's revelation. It's not an interpretation only or a simple reception of revelation. It adds to what revelation is. It's part of this ever growing and shifting constellation that's multimedia, that's image and text and sound and performance and so on. That is revelation. And I want to try to kind of imagine Revelation in that way, and even the Bible in that way, rather than in terms of a kind of original text that then gets kind of incarnated in different works, but rather as a kind of ongoing multimedia process and engagement that we're all part of.
That's why the text keeps speaking to us, and we need to keep engaging with these stories and images. I think our imagination.
Yeah.
There's some good
You wanna?
feedback.
I don't know. You're looking at it. I'm not looking at it.
Well, it's good. Mandy said maybe it's the disappointment of Hildegard and others' immediacy expectations that make us suspicious of our own longing for or sense of cataclysmic change. Yeah, good. Well, we have 3 minutes. Maybe we end a little early.
I think that's fine to do. Yeah. If it were 3.5 minutes early, that would be better in Revelation language. But
yes,
3
or
is
7.
Good. So maybe we'll do another one sometime, another series. Want to recommend again office hours, which are
they just finished their session on Job.
Right.
Brought to you by Columbia Theological Seminary and Brendan Breed and Chris Holmes. Yeah. And it was a great study on Sunday mornings, as long as I guess we're.
Yeah, and those two are recorded, so you can go back and look at them anytime too.
They were an inspiration for ours.
That's right.
And we stole the title from Forest Hill Church, John Lynn's Bibles and Bagels, just to give credit. We have Forest Hill Church people on here.
Oh
too.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Hen.
So thanks, babe. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, you all. Thanks for doing Revelation and Apocalypticism with us, and share the video, the Bible study, with others. It'll be available tomorrow on Montview's website and YouTube, so you don't have to be part of Facebook. Tell your friends and take advantage of it. All right.
Great.
Be well. Thanks so much for joining, and have a great Sunday.